The telegram had promised comfort, prosperity, and a gentleman rancher with a sprawling estate in the Arizona Territory. But as Lillian Jenkins stepped off the dusty stagecoach in Gila Bend on that sweltering afternoon in August 1883, she saw nothing but endless desert and a scattering of weathered buildings that barely qualified as a town. Her silk traveling dress, once a deep emerald green, now bore the brown stains of 3 weeks' worth of trail dust. The feathers in her hat drooped sadly in the oppressive heat, and her feet ached inside her too tight boots. She set down her trunk with a thud that sent up a small cloud of Arizona dust, squinting against the brutal sun as she searched for any sign of the man who had written her such eloquent letters over the past 6 months. Matthew Owen was supposed to meet her here at 3 o'clock. The stagecoach driver had already deposited her belongings and rumbled away, leaving her standing alone on the dirt road that served as Gila Bend's main street. Sweat trickled down her spine beneath her corset, and she was acutely aware of the curious stares from the handful of townspeople going about their business. A mercantile stood to her left, its wooden sign creaking in the hot breeze. Across the way, a saloon's doors swung lazily, and she could hear the tinny sound of a piano being played badly. "Miss Jenkins." She turned to find a man approaching on horseback, leading a second horse behind him. Her heart sank. This could not be Matthew Owen, the man who had written to her about his prosperous ranch, his fine home, his need for an educated woman to share his success. Surely that man would arrive in a proper carriage, dressed in fine clothes befitting his station. This man wore dusty work clothes, a worn hat pushed back on sun-bronzed skin, and boots that had seen better days. He was tall and lean, with broad shoulders and capable hands that gripped the reins with easy confidence. His face was handsome enough, she supposed, with strong features and eyes the color of whiskey in sunlight, but he looked like every other cowhand she had seen along her journey west. "I am Lillian Jenkins," she said carefully, hoping against hope that this was merely a ranch hand sent to fetch her. He dismounted with fluid grace and removed his hat, revealing dark brown hair that curled slightly at the collar. "Matthew Owen, madam. I am pleased to finally meet you in person." Lillian felt her stomach drop to somewhere near her ankles. This was Matthew Owen. This dusty cowboy with the work-roughened hands and simple clothes. She had left everything behind in Philadelphia. Her position as a governess, her small but comfortable room in a respectable boarding house, her friends, the familiar streets and shops. She had done it all based on letters that spoke of prosperity and comfort, of a life far better than what she could achieve on her own as a single woman approaching 23 with no family and few prospects. "You look surprised," he said, and there was something guarded in his expression now, as if he was reading her disappointment clearly on her face. "I suppose I am," she admitted, seeing no point in dissembling. "Your letters painted a rather different picture, Mr. Owen." His jaw tightened. "I have a ranch, just as I said. Cattle, horses, good grazing land when the rains come. I did not lie to you, Miss Jenkins. But you neglected to mention certain details, I think." Her voice came out sharper than she intended, fear and disappointment making her tongue acid. "I reckon you are disappointed that I am not some fancy gentleman in a suit," he said, his own tone cooling. "But I am an honest man and I work hard. I can provide for a wife, give her a decent life. That is what I promised and that is what I can deliver." Lillian looked around at the dusty street, the harsh landscape, the brutal sun beating down without mercy. "Where is your carriage, Mr. Owen? I have a wagon for hauling supplies. I brought horses for us to ride. The ranch is about 5 miles out of town. 5 miles on horseback. In this heat," she gestured at her traveling dress, her trunk, her hat box, and carpet bag. I can strap your trunk to one of the horses. You can ride with your other bags." He was watching her now with an expression she could not quite read. "Unless you would prefer to stay in town tonight, Mrs. Henderson runs a boarding house. It is clean enough and respectable." Lillian considered this. Part of her wanted nothing more than to turn around, find the next stagecoach heading back east, and admit defeat. But she had spent nearly every penny she had saved to make this journey. She had nowhere to go back to, no position waiting, no family to shelter her. Pride and practicality warred within her breast, and practicality won as it always did. "I can ride," she said stiffly, "though I will need a moment to change into something more suitable." Mrs. Henderson's boarding house turned out to be a small adobe building with 3 rooms for rent, and a proprietress, who asked no questions but provided Lillian with a basin of cool water and privacy to change into her riding habit. It was made of dark gray wool and had been far too warm even in Philadelphia's spring weather. In Arizona's August heat, it was nearly unbearable, but it was all she had. When she emerged, Matthew was waiting with the horses, her trunk securely fastened behind one saddle. He helped her mount without comment, his hands firm at her waist for the brief moment it took to lift her into the saddle. Then he swung up onto his own horse with practiced ease and led the way out of town. They rode in silence for the first mile. The landscape was like nothing Lillian had ever seen. Philadelphia had trees and grass, buildings and cobblestone streets. This was all scrub brush and sand, distant mountains shimmering in the heat, and sky that seemed to go on forever. It was beautiful in its own harsh way, she supposed, but it was also terrifying in its emptiness. What had she done, coming to this desolate place to marry a stranger? "I know I disappointed you," Matthew said finally, breaking the silence. "I can see it plain on your face. But I want you to know, I did not set out to deceive you." "Then why did your letters speak of prosperity and comfort as if you were a man of considerable means?" she asked, genuine curiosity overcoming her earlier anger. He was quiet for a moment, guiding his horse around a stand of prickly pear cactus. "Because I am prosperous by the standards of this country. I own my land outright, no mortgage. I have a herd of 200 cattle and 30 horses. I have money in the bank in Tucson. Compared to most folks trying to make a living in the Arizona territory, I am doing well. But compared to what I understood from your letters, you are a simple rancher, not a wealthy landowner." "I reckon that is fair," he admitted. "The truth is, Miss Jenkins, educated women do not often come west looking for husbands. I thought if I emphasized what I did have rather than what I lacked, I might have a chance at finding someone suitable. Someone intelligent who could read and write, who might want to make a life out here. I should have been more forthright. I apologize for that." His honesty, at least, was refreshing. Lillian adjusted her grip on the reins, feeling the horse's steady rhythm beneath her. "And the mansion you spoke of in your 3rd letter, where you described the fine wood floors and the view from the veranda," she heard him sigh. "I got carried away. I was describing what I hoped to build someday, not what I have now. That was wrong of me. So what do you have now? A cabin. 2 rooms, wood floor, good roof. It is not fancy, but it is solid. I built it myself 4 years ago when I settled here. There is a well, a barn, corrals for the horses, a garden that does well enough when I remember to water it, a cabin. 2 rooms." Lillian felt her eyes sting and blinked hard. She would not cry, not here, not in front of this man who had essentially lied to her in order to lure her across a continent. But what choice did she have now? She had signed the contract. She had agreed to marry him. And even if she had not, where would she go? Back to Philadelphia with no money, no prospects, no references for a new position. They crested a small rise and Matthew pointed ahead. "There, that is home." Lillian looked and felt her heart sink even further. The cabin sat in a shallow valley where a line of cottonwood trees suggested the presence of water. It was, as he had said, solidly built, with a stone chimney and a covered porch along the front. But it was small, so much smaller than she had imagined. The barn beside it was actually larger than the house. Corrals made of rough wood stretched behind the barn, and she could see horses grazing in a fenced pasture beyond. A garden plot near the house showed rows of struggling vegetables. It was the very definition of a hardscrabble frontier homestead. There was nothing prosperous or comfortable about it, no matter what standards one applied. Matthew glanced at her as they rode down the slope toward the cabin. "I know it is not what you expected. If you want to go back to town, stay at the boarding house and take the next stage out. I will give you money for the ticket. I will not hold you to the contract if you truly cannot abide this." There was something in his voice, a resignation mixed with disappointment that made Lillian look at him more carefully. In the golden light of late afternoon, with the harsh sun finally beginning to lose some of its intensity, she saw that he was younger than she had first thought, perhaps not yet 30. His face had the weathered look of a man who spent his days outdoors, but his eyes held intelligence and, yes, kindness. This was not a cruel man or a deliberately dishonest one. He was simply a lonely man who had bent the truth in hopes of finding a companion in this isolated place. "I do not have money for a ticket back east," she said quietly. "I spent everything I had to come here. I know. That is why I am offering to pay your way. You would do that. Release me from the contract and pay for my return journey, even though you paid the bride price and my travel expenses to get here. I would rather be alone than force a woman to stay who does not want to be here," he said simply. They had reached the cabin now, and he dismounted, then came to help her down. His hands were gentle at her waist, and he set her on her feet with care. "I have been alone for a long time, Miss Jenkins. I can continue that way if I must, but I will not trap you in a life you cannot bear." Lillian stood in front of the cabin, looking up at him. He was tall, she realized, perhaps 6 feet or more, and she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Those eyes were steady and honest now, waiting for her decision without pressure. She thought of Philadelphia, of the cramped boarding house room, the demanding families she had worked for as a governess, the certain knowledge that she would never have a home of her own, never have children, never have anything but the life of a spinster dependent on the whims of employers. She thought of the long journey west, the hope that had grown in her heart despite her practical nature, the dreams she had allowed herself to dream based on those carefully worded letters. Then she looked at the cabin again. It was small, yes, and simple, but the porch was swept clean. Flowers grew in a pot beside the door, bright red geraniums that someone had taken the time to water and tend. The windows, small as they were, gleamed clean in the slanting sunlight. This was a home, not just a shelter. Someone had built this with care and lived here with pride. "May I see inside?" she asked. Something like hope flickered in Matthew's expression. "Of course." He led her up the 2 steps to the porch and opened the door. The interior was dim after the bright sunlight, and Lillian had to pause to let her eyes adjust. When they did, she found herself in a single large room that served as kitchen, dining area, and parlor all in one. The wood floor was worn but clean, covered in places by rag rugs that added spots of color. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a cast iron stove beside it for cooking. A simple table with 2 chairs stood near the kitchen area. A rocking chair faced the fireplace, and beside it was a small bookshelf crowded with volumes. "The bedroom is through there," Matthew said, pointing to a door in the back wall. "There is a bed, a dresser, a washstand." Nothing fancy but serviceable. I can sleep out here, give you privacy until we are married, or until you decide to leave, whichever comes first." Lillian walked slowly around the room, taking in the details, the dishes neatly stacked on a shelf, the lanterns hanging from hooks, their glass chimneys spotless, the books, their spines showing titles from Shakespeare to agricultural manuals. Everything was neat, clean, organized. This was not the home of a slovenly bachelor. This was the home of a man who took care of his possessions, who had built something out of nothing in this harsh land. She moved to the bookshelf and ran her finger along the spines. "You enjoy reading." "When I have time, which is not often during the day. But at night, yes. It reminds me that there is a wider world out there, even if I choose to live in this corner of it." "You choose this. You were not forced west by circumstance." "I came from Missouri after the war," he said. "I was young, just 16 when it ended. I did not want to farm like my father, and there was nothing for me there anyway. The war took my 2 brothers and left my parents bitter and broken. I wanted to start fresh, make something of my own. So I came west, worked as a ranch hand for years, saved every penny, and finally bought this land. That was 4 years ago. I have been building it up ever since." Lillian turned to face him. "Why did you want a wife? You seem quite capable of managing on your own." He took off his hat and held it in his hands, turning it slowly. "I am 30 years old, Miss Jenkins. I have a home, a livelihood, a future, but I have no one to share it with. I eat my meals alone, I sleep alone, I work alone most days unless I hire help for roundup or branding. I wanted someone to talk to in the evenings, someone to share the work and the rewards. Maybe children someday, a family. I did not want to wake up at 50 and realize I had lived my whole life without any of that." It was the most he had said since she had met him, and the raw honesty in his words touched something in Lillian's chest. She understood loneliness. She had lived with it every day in Philadelphia, surrounded by people but belonging to none of them. Here at least the loneliness was honest, acknowledged, out in the open under this vast sky. "I need time," she said. "Time to think, to adjust, to see if I can truly make a life here." "That is fair. How much time? A week? 2 weeks?" She was not sure what she was asking for. Time to grow accustomed to the heat, the isolation, the primitive conditions. Time to know if she could respect this man enough to marry him. Time to understand what she was giving up and what she might gain. "Take all the time you need," Matthew said. "I meant what I said. I will not force you to stay. But while you are deciding, you might as well learn what life here is like. Tomorrow I will show you the ranch, introduce you to the animals, teach you what needs doing. Then you can make a decision based on truth rather than imagination. That seems sensible. Are you hungry? I have stew cooking. It is nothing fancy, just beef and vegetables, but it will fill you up." Lillian realized she was famished. She had eaten nothing since a brief stop at noon when the stage had paused to change horses. "Thank you, yes." They ate together at the small table as the sun set beyond the windows. The stew was simple but well seasoned and surprisingly good. Matthew explained that he had learned to cook out of necessity, but had discovered he did not mind it. He told her about the ranch, the cattle that ranged over his 3,000 acres, the horses he was breeding with the goal of selling to the cavalry post at Fort Grant. He talked about the challenges of ranching in Arizona, the need for water, the constant threat of drought, the occasional raids by cattle thieves. Lillian listened and found herself asking questions. How did he manage alone? He hired help when needed and had good relationships with neighboring ranchers who would assist during roundup. What did he do for supplies? He rode into Gila Bend once a month, or to the larger town of Yuma if he needed something special. Was he not afraid of the isolation? Sometimes, he admitted, but mostly he found it peaceful. After dinner, she insisted on washing the dishes while he brought in her trunk and bags. When she emerged from the bedroom after unpacking her few belongings, she found him making a bed for himself on the floor near the fireplace, using blankets and a saddle for a pillow. "That cannot be comfortable," she said. "I have slept in worse places." He straightened and gave her a slight smile. "There is a chamber pot under the bed, and if you need anything in the night, just call out. The door has a latch on the inside if you want privacy. Thank you." They stood there awkwardly for a moment, two strangers who had agreed to marry without ever having met. Lillian felt exhaustion pulling at her bones. The journey, the disappointment, the decisions weighing on her, all of it pressed down until she could barely keep her eyes open. "Good night, Mr. Owen," she said. "Good night, Miss Jenkins. And Lillian, if I may, I truly am sorry I was not what you hoped for, but I will do my best to be a good husband if you choose to stay." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and retreated to the bedroom, closing the door behind her. The bed was simple, but the mattress was filled with fresh straw and covered with clean sheets, and a wedding ring quilt that someone had sewn with care. She undressed down to her chemise and climbed between the sheets, her body grateful for rest even as her mind spun with thoughts. She had expected a mansion and found a cabin. She had expected a wealthy gentleman and found a working cowboy. But she had also found honesty, kindness, and a man who was willing to let her go if she could not be happy. That was more than many women found in their marriages, even in the civilized East. Lillian fell asleep to the sound of crickets chirping in the darkness, and the faint rustle of Matthew settling onto his makeshift bed in the next room. When she woke in the night, disoriented and thirsty, she lay still and listened to his steady breathing beyond the door. It was oddly comforting, knowing she was not alone in this strange place. Morning came too early, announced by a rooster's crow and the pale light of dawn creeping through the small window. Lillian dressed in her simplest day dress, a practical calico that had seen much wear. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Matthew already up, the stove lit, and the smell of coffee filling the cabin. "Morning," he said, glancing up from the eggs he was frying. "I hope you slept well." "Well enough, thank you." She moved to the window and looked out at the landscape revealed by daylight. The mountains in the distance were painted pink and gold by the rising sun. The cottonwood trees near the cabin rustled in a morning breeze. It was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way. They ate breakfast together, and then Matthew handed her a pair of worn leather gloves. "These were meant as a gift, but they will serve a practical purpose too. We have work to do." He led her outside and began the tour he had promised. First to the barn, where she met his 2 draft horses, patient creatures with gentle eyes who took sugar from her palm with soft lips. Then to the corrals, where a dozen horses lifted their heads curiously at her approach. He pointed out his best breeding stallion, a handsome bay with black points, and the mares he was crossing with him. "Good bone, smart, steady temperament," he explained. "That is what the army wants. Pretty does not matter much if a horse bolts at the first gunshot." He showed her the garden, apologizing for its bedraggled state. "I keep it alive, but just barely. Vegetables need attention I cannot always give when the cattle need tending." "I am good with gardens," Lillian said, examining the rows. "My mother was a keen gardener before she died. She taught me young." Hope flickered in Matthew's face. "That would be helpful. Fresh vegetables make a big difference in winter." They walked out to where the cattle were grazing on the scrubby grass, taking advantage of the morning cool before the brutal heat of midday drove them to shade. Matthew pointed out the water source, a spring-fed creek that ran year-round, which was why he had chosen this particular parcel of land. "Water is everything in this country," he said. You can have land and cattle and good weather, but without water, you have nothing. As they walked back toward the cabin, Lillian found herself noticing things. The way Matthew moved with easy confidence in this landscape, clearly at home. The way he spoke to the animals with patience and respect. The way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, alert for anything amiss. This was a man who knew his business, who had built something real through hard work and determination. "What would my role be?" she asked suddenly. "If I stayed, if we married, what would you expect of me?" Matthew stopped walking and turned to face her. "I would expect you to help with the garden, the chickens, the house. Cooking, cleaning, mending, maybe helping with the horses if you are willing. They are gentler than cattle and easier for a woman to handle. I would expect you to be a partner, not a servant. I make the decisions about the ranch and the business, but I would value your opinion. And I would treat you with respect, provide for you, protect you. That is what a husband should do. And children, if God blesses us with them, yes. But I would not expect you to bear a child every year until it killed you, which is what too many men demand. I would want us to be sensible, to think of your health and our ability to care for the children we have." Lillian studied his face. "You have thought about this a great deal." "I had a lot of time to think while I was waiting for you to arrive." He smiled slightly. 6 months is a long time to imagine what married life might be like." "I imagined it too," she admitted. "Though what I imagined and what I found are quite different. I know, and I am sorry for that. But Lillian, can I tell you something? When you stepped off that stage coach yesterday, even covered in dust and disappointed, you were the prettiest thing I had seen in longer than I can remember. And when you started asking me smart questions about the ranch, when you admitted you were disappointed but heard me out anyway, I thought maybe I did not deserve a woman like you, but I sure wanted to try to earn you." His words were simple but sincere, and Lillian felt her cheeks warm. No man had ever spoken to her this way. The men in Philadelphia had ignored her, seeing her only as a governess, a woman too poor and too plain to consider. But Matthew looked at her as if she was something precious, even here in the harsh morning light with her hair already escaping its pins and her dress dusty from walking. "You are not what I expected either," she said softly. "But perhaps that is not entirely a bad thing." The days fell into a rhythm. Lillian rose early and helped Matthew with the morning chores. She fed the chickens he kept in a coop beside the barn and collected eggs. She learned to milk the cow, though her first attempts had both her and the cow equally frustrated. She worked in the garden, cutting back dead growth, watering faithfully, coaxing life from the tired plants. She cooked meals, cleaned the cabin, washed clothes in the big tub outside, and hung them on the line to dry in the hot Arizona sun. Matthew worked from dawn until dusk, always finding something that needed doing. Fences to mend, horses to train, cattle to check on, hay to cut and store for winter. But he always came in for the noon meal and again at sunset, and those times became precious to Lillian. They would sit together at the little table and talk about their days, about the ranch, about the world beyond this isolated valley. She learned that he was well-read and thoughtful, that he had strong opinions on politics and philosophy, that he believed in education and progress, even while choosing to live a simple life. He asked about her childhood in Philadelphia, her years as a governess, the families she had worked for. She told him about the loneliness of being neither servant nor family member, the way she had cared for other women's children, and wondered if she would ever have her own. "You would be a good mother," he said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. "I have seen you with the animals, gentle but firm. That is how a mother should be." "My mother was like that," Lillian said. "She died when I was 15. My father followed her a year later. I think he died of grief as much as the influenza. I am sorry. That must have been hard. It taught me to rely on myself. I had no family willing to take me in, so I found work and made my own way. It was not the life I dreamed of as a girl, but it was respectable and safe. And now, Matthew asked, do you feel safe here? Lillian considered this. The Arizona territory was wild and dangerous in ways that Philadelphia had never been. But with Matthew, she did feel safe. He was strong and capable, and she had come to trust that he would protect her from any threat. Yes, she said. Surprisingly, I do. A week passed, then another. Lillian told herself she was still deciding, still weighing her options. But the truth was that she had already made her choice, even if she was not quite ready to admit it. She had come to look forward to Matthew's return each evening, to the easy conversation and comfortable silences they shared. She had come to appreciate the beauty of this harsh landscape, the way the light changed throughout the day, the brilliant stars at night undimmed by city lights. She had come to feel that the cabin, small as it was, had become home. On the 15th day after her arrival, Matthew rode out before dawn to help a neighbor with a difficult horse. Lillian spent the morning working in the garden, pleased with how much it had improved under her care. She was hanging laundry when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. For a moment she thought Matthew had returned early, but these were multiple horses, and they were coming fast. 4 men rode into the yard, and Lillian knew immediately they were trouble. They had the hard look of outlaws, with guns on their hips and cold eyes that swept over her with insolent appraisal. She stood her ground beside the clothesline, her heart hammering but her face calm. "Well now," said the man in front, a bearded brute with tobacco-stained teeth. "Looks like Owen got himself a woman. Pretty little thing, are you not?" "This is private property," Lillian said, keeping her voice steady. "You need to leave." The men laughed. "Hear that, boys? She wants us to leave. Maybe we will once we have a look around." "Owen owes us for that water hole he claimed was on his property." "My husband is due back any moment," Lillian said, though she had no idea when Matthew would return. "If you have business with him, you can wait in town and speak to him there." "Husband is she." The leader dismounted and walked toward her. "Funny, I heard Owen was bringing in a mail-order bride. That means you are not married yet, does it? Which makes you fair game." Lillian backed toward the cabin, her mind racing. The shotgun was inside, mounted on hooks above the fireplace. If she could reach it, she might be able to hold them off. But the man was faster than he looked. He grabbed her arm with a grip that would leave bruises. "Let her go." Matthew's voice cracked across the yard like a whip. Lillian turned her head and saw him sitting on his horse at the edge of the yard, a rifle resting across his saddle, aimed steadily at the man holding her arm. "Owen," the man said, but he did not release Lillian. "We were just paying a friendly visit." "There is nothing friendly about 4 armed men showing up when I am not home and putting hands on my wife. That is the last time I will tell you. Let her go, get on your horse and ride out, all of you. That water hole is on open range. You got no right to fence it off. The deed says otherwise, and you know it. We settled this with the land office 6 months ago. You lost. Now you are trespassing, and if you do not leave right now, I will shoot you for it." The tension was thick enough to cut. Lillian could feel the man's grip on her arm, could see the calculation in his eyes as he weighed his chances. Matthew sat motionless on his horse, the rifle steady, his face hard as stone. Finally, the man shoved Lillian away from him. She stumbled but caught herself. "This is not over, Owen. You cannot claim all the water in the territory. I claimed what is mine by legal right. If you want water, buy your own land or dig your own well. Now get out of my sight before I change my mind about letting you leave." The 4 men mounted up, making a show of taking their time, but they rode out. Matthew waited until they were out of sight before he dismounted and came to Lillian. She was shaking now, the fear catching up with her now that the danger had passed. "Are you hurt?" he asked, taking her shoulders gently and looking her over. "No, just frightened. Matthew, I am sorry. I should have had the shotgun with me." "You should not have to defend yourself on your own property," he said grimly. "Those men are trouble. They run cattle on open range and think they have a right to anyone's water. I fenced that spring legally, but they have been trying to intimidate me into opening it up. Now that they know you are here, I need to take precautions." "What kind of precautions?" "Hiring a ranch hand, someone who can be here when I cannot. Teaching you to shoot properly, not just have a shotgun nearby. Maybe getting a dog, something that will bark when strangers approach." He cupped her face in his hands. "Lillian, I would never forgive myself if something happened to you because of me." She covered his hands with hers. "I am all right. You came in time. But if I had not, if I had been delayed even a few minutes," his voice was rough with fear and anger, "you could have been hurt or worse. But I was not. You protected me just as you promised you would." She looked up at him and realized how close they were standing, how warm his hands felt against her face, how his amber eyes had darkened with emotion. "Matthew, I have made my decision." "What decision?" "About staying. About marrying you. I want to stay. I want to be your wife, truly." He stared at her. "Are you certain you are not just saying this because you were frightened?" "No, I have been certain for days now, but I was too stubborn to admit it. This place, this cabin, it is not what I expected, but it is what I need. What I want. If you still want me." Instead of answering with words, Matthew bent his head and kissed her. It was not the chaste kiss of a formal engagement, but something deeper, full of relief and promise and the beginning of passion. Lillian had been kissed only once before, by a boy in Philadelphia who had been clumsy and presumptuous. This was nothing like that. Matthew kissed her as if she was precious, as if he had been waiting his whole life for this moment. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. "We will ride into town tomorrow and find the preacher. I want you safe and protected by law as my wife. But Lillian, I want you to know I will wait as long as you need before we truly share a bed. Marriage is more than just that. I want you to be comfortable, to feel ready." "I know," she said softly, "and I appreciate that. But Matthew, I am ready to be your wife in all ways. I trust you." They were married the next day in Gila Bend small church, with Mrs. Henderson and the storekeeper as witnesses. Lillian wore her best dress, and Matthew had shaved and put on a clean shirt. The ceremony was simple, the words familiar. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, and told Matthew he could kiss his bride, he did so with gentle reverence that made Lillian's heart swell. They rode back to the ranch as the sun was setting, and this time when Matthew carried her bags into the cabin, he carried them into the bedroom they would now share. That night, he made love to her with patience and care, making sure she felt pleasure as well as fulfilling his own needs. Afterwards, lying in his arms with her head on his chest, Lillian felt a peace she had never known. She was home. Finally, truly home. The months that followed were not easy. Ranch life was demanding, and there were days when Lillian wondered if she had the strength to continue. The heat was oppressive through September and into October. The work never ended. Matthew hired a ranch hand named Tom who proved reliable and helped ease some of the burden. He built a small bunkhouse for Tom to sleep in and spent money on improvements to the cabin, adding a proper kitchen area with a good stove and shelves for storage. Lillian threw herself into making the cabin a true home. She sewed curtains for the windows and made cushions for the rocking chair. She planted flowers in pots on the porch and herbs in the garden for cooking. She learned to make bread in the difficult Arizona heat and how to preserve vegetables for the winter. She learned to ride better, to handle a rifle, to assist with the horses when needed. But more than the physical changes, she found herself falling in love with her husband. Not the hasty decision to stay and marry, but true love that grew deeper each day. She loved the way Matthew's face lit up when he came in for supper and saw her waiting. She loved how he asked her opinion on ranch matters and truly listened to her answers. She loved the way he held her at night, safe and warm in his arms. She loved his quiet strength, his integrity, his gentle humor. One evening in late November, as they sat by the fireplace wrapped in quilts against the desert's surprising cold, Matthew said, "I have been thinking." "About what?" Lillian was darning a sock and she looked up from her work. "About next year. I want to start building an addition to the cabin. Another bedroom for when we have children, and maybe a proper parlor so we do not have to live in one big room. I know it is not the mansion I promised, but I want to give you more space, more comfort." "Matthew, I do not need a mansion. This cabin feels like heaven because you are in it." "That is all I need." He reached over and took her hand. "How did I get so lucky? I wrote those letters expecting nothing and I got you." "I expected a mansion and got so much more," she said. "I got a partner, a home, a future. I got love, though I did not even know to look for it." He pulled her into his lap, the sock falling forgotten to the floor. "I love you, Lillian Owen. I think I started falling in love with you the day you arrived, all dusty and disappointed but still brave enough to give this a chance." "I love you too," she whispered. "More than I ever thought possible." They kissed, and the kiss deepened, and Matthew carried her to their bed where they loved each other with growing passion and familiarity. Later, drifting toward sleep, Lillian thought about the journey that had brought her here. The letters that had promised one thing and delivered another. The disappointment that had turned to acceptance and then to joy. The stranger who had become the center of her world. Winter settled over the Arizona territory, cold nights and mild days, blessed rain that turned the desert green for a brief time. Christmas came, and Lillian decorated the cabin with pine branches Tom cut from the mountains and strings of dried berries. She and Matthew exchanged simple gifts. She had sewn him a warm shirt from fabric she ordered from the mercantile, and he gave her a music box that played a sweet melody when wound. It had cost him more than he could afford, she suspected, but the look on his face when she exclaimed over it made clear that he considered it worth every penny. In January, Lillian began to suspect she was pregnant. She waited until she was sure before telling Matthew, wanting to be certain before raising his hopes. When she finally told him on a cold evening in late February, he lifted her off her feet and spun her around, laughing with pure joy. "A baby. We are going to have a baby. When?" "Late summer, I think. August or September." He set her down carefully as if she might break. "Should you be working so hard? The garden, the chickens, all of it. Maybe we should hire someone to help you." "Matthew, I am pregnant, not ill. Women have been doing their work while expecting babies since the beginning of time. I will be fine." But he fussed over her anyway, trying to take on her chores in addition to his own until she had to sit him down and explain that she needed to stay busy, needed to feel useful. They compromised. She would accept help with the heavier tasks, and he would stop treating her like she was made of glass. As her belly swelled with their child, Matthew began working on the addition to the cabin. He and Tom framed out 2 new rooms, one that would be a nursery and one a proper bedroom for when the baby was older and needed space. It was hard work in the spring heat, but Matthew was determined to have it finished before the baby came. Lillian sewed baby clothes from soft cotton fabric and knitted tiny blankets. Mrs. Henderson from town came to visit several times, bringing gifts and advice. Other ranch wives stopped by, women Lillian had only met briefly in town, now welcoming her to their circle. She realized she was no longer alone. She had become part of a community, these hardy women who made homes in the harsh desert and raised families against all odds. In late August, on a night when the heat still shimmered even after the sun went down, Lillian went into labor. Matthew rode for the midwife, an older woman named Mrs. Garcia who lived on a ranch 10 miles away. She arrived by midnight and took charge with calm efficiency. Tom made himself scarce, camping out near the barn while Matthew stayed by Lillian's side, holding her hand through the long hours of labor. Their son was born just before dawn, arriving with a lusty cry that announced his displeasure at being thrust into the world. Matthew wept when Mrs. Garcia placed the baby in his arms, this tiny scrap of humanity they had created together. "He is perfect," Matthew breathed, staring down at his son. "Lillian, he is perfect. What should we name him?" she asked tiredly, watching her husband fall in love with their child. "I was thinking Michael, after my older brother who died in the war. Michael Owen. What do you think?" "I think it is a fine name," Lillian said. "Hello, Michael. Welcome to your home." The baby settled into their lives, filling the cabin with his cries and coos, his demands and his innocent joy. Lillian had never been so exhausted or so happy. Matthew proved to be a devoted father, rising in the night to bring the baby to her for feeding, changing dirty cloths without complaint, spending hours just holding his son and marveling at him. The ranch prospered. The cattle herd grew, and Matthew sold a dozen trained horses to Fort Grant for a good price. He hired another ranch hand for the busy season and began talking about buying the adjacent property when it came available. The addition to the cabin was finished, giving them much-needed space. 2 years passed, and then 3. Michael grew into a sturdy toddler with his father's dark hair and his mother's blue eyes. Lillian became pregnant again, and this time their daughter was born in early spring, an easier birth than the first. They named her Emily, and she was a calm baby where Michael had been fussy, content to watch the world with solemn eyes. Lillian often thought about that day she had stepped off the stagecoach in Gila Bend, hot and tired and disappointed by what she found. If someone had told her then that she would come to love this life, this place, this man with all her heart, she would not have believed it. But love, she had learned, was not about grand gestures and fancy houses. It was about the small moments. The way Matthew still kissed her goodbye every morning, the way he looked at their children with such pride and tenderness, the way he had built not just a ranch but a life, a future, a family. One evening when Michael was 5 and Emily 3, they all sat on the porch watching the sunset as they often did. The children were playing in the dirt with small wooden animals Matthew had carved for them. Lillian sat in the rocking chair with her hands resting on her belly, pregnant with their 3rd child. Matthew stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder. "You ever miss Philadelphia?" he asked. Lillian looked out at the desert landscape painted gold and pink by the setting sun. She looked at her children, healthy and happy. She looked up at her husband, this good man who had given her everything she never knew she needed. "No," she said simply. "I am exactly where I am meant to be." Matthew squeezed her shoulder. "I thank God for you every day. For saying yes, for staying, for giving me a chance even when I did not deserve it." "You deserved it," she said softly. "You are a good man, Matthew Owen, the best man I have ever known." Their 3rd child was born in November, another boy they named James. He had his father's amber eyes and a sunny disposition that charmed everyone he met. The cabin was crowded now, full of noise and laughter, and the chaos that came with 3 young children. Matthew began making plans to build a proper house, something larger with separate rooms for the growing family. But Lillian was in no hurry. The cabin held all her happiest memories. It was where she had learned to love Matthew, where they had built their life together, where their children had been born. A bigger house would be nice someday, but this cabin would always be the place where she had found home. Years continued to pass in the way they do on a ranch, marked not by dates on a calendar but by the rhythm of the seasons. Branding in spring, haying in summer, roundup in fall, maintenance in winter. The children grew, each year bringing new challenges and joys. Michael showed an early aptitude for working with horses, patient and gentle like his father. Emily proved to be a natural at caring for the garden and the household, already helping her mother at age 6. James was the wild one, always getting into mischief, bringing home injured animals to heal, fearless and loving in equal measure. The ranch continued to prosper. Matthew's careful management and hard work paid off. He was able to buy the adjacent property, expanding their grazing land. He built a new house, though not a mansion. It was a solid 2-story home with a real parlor, a proper kitchen, 4 bedrooms, and even a small room that served as Matthew's office. But they kept the cabin as a guest house, and sometimes Lillian would walk over there when the house got too noisy and sit in the old rocking chair, remembering those early days when it had been just her and Matthew learning to love each other. When Michael was 10, Emily 8, and James 6, Lillian gave birth to their 4th and final child, a daughter they named Sarah. The birth was difficult, and the doctor from Yuma who had come to help warned that another pregnancy would be dangerous. Matthew and Lillian accepted this news calmly. They had been blessed with 4 healthy children, more than many families could claim. Their family was complete. The years brought changes beyond their ranch. Arizona became a state in 1912, bringing celebration to Gila Bend and the surrounding territory. The children grew into young adults with dreams of their own. Michael took over more and more of the ranch work, clearly his father's son in every way. Emily met a young man from Yuma, a schoolteacher, and married him in a ceremony at the ranch with the whole community in attendance. James decided he wanted to study veterinary medicine and left for school in California, though he promised to return and bring his skills back to Arizona. Sarah, the baby, showed signs of being as stubborn and independent as her mother. Through it all, Matthew and Lillian's love deepened and matured. They had weathered droughts and floods, difficult births and childhood illnesses, financial worries and the normal struggles of raising a family. But they had weathered it all together, and their partnership had only grown stronger. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Matthew surprised Lillian by taking her back to Gila Bend, to the very spot where she had first stepped off the stagecoach. The town had grown some over the years, with new buildings and even a small hotel replacing Mrs. Henderson's boarding house after she passed away. "I wanted to bring you here," Matthew said, holding her hand as they stood in the dusty street, "to the place where our life together began." "I was so disappointed that day," Lillian said, smiling at the memory. "So certain I had made a terrible mistake. And now I know that stepping off that stagecoach was the best decision I ever made. Well, that and deciding to stay." Matthew pulled her close, right there in the middle of town, not caring who saw. "I love you, Lillian Owen. I loved you when you were young and beautiful, and I love you now that we are getting old together. I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "We are not so old yet," she protested, though her hair was indeed more gray than brown now, and there were lines around her eyes from years of squinting into the Arizona sun. "Old enough to have lived a lifetime together, old enough to know how rare what we have is." He kissed her softly. Thank you for giving me a chance. Thank you for seeing past the cabin to the man inside. Thank you for being worth seeing, she replied. They stood there for a while longer, remembering, before climbing into their wagon and heading home. Home to the ranch, to the house Matthew had built, to the children and grandchildren that were starting to come. Home to the life they had built together from nothing but hope and hard work and love. More years passed. Michael married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring property, and they had 3 children of their own. He and Matthew ran the ranch together, expanding it further until the Owen Ranch was one of the most successful in the region. Emily and her husband moved back from Yuma when he took a position at the new school in Gila Bend, and her 5 children filled the house with noise and laughter whenever they visited. James returned from veterinary school and set up practice in town, caring for animals across 3 counties. Sarah, true to her independent nature, became a teacher and traveled to various ranch communities, bringing education to children who had no schools nearby. Matthew and Lillian watched their children build their own lives with pride and satisfaction. They had given them a foundation of love and hard work, faith and integrity. Now they could see those values reflected in the adults their children had become. When Matthew turned 60, he began gradually turning over more of the ranch work to Michael, though he could not quite stop himself from rising early and checking on things each morning. Lillian finally had time to pursue some of the interests she had put aside during the busy years of child rearing. She started a ladies' literary society in Gila Bend, bringing together ranch wives and town women to discuss books and ideas. She wrote letters to her scattered children and growing number of grandchildren. She tended her garden, now large and elaborate, famous throughout the region for its abundance. But the best times were still the evenings spent with Matthew on their porch, watching the sun set over the desert they had made their home. They would sit together, sometimes talking, sometimes silent, hands linked, comfortable in the companionship of decades together. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had taken that stage back east?" Matthew asked one evening. "No," Lillian said firmly. "I never wonder about that. This is my life, the one I chose, and I have never regretted it for a moment. Not even in the beginning. When you first saw the cabin and realized I had exaggerated in my letters," she smiled. "Well, perhaps for a moment or two. But Matthew, you gave me so much more than a mansion could ever have provided. You gave me love, partnership, family, a home. The cabin was small, but you made it feel like heaven." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it. "You made me whole, Lillian. Before you came, I was just existing, working, surviving. You taught me what it meant to truly live." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. The desert night settled around them, vast and ancient and beautiful. Matthew and Lillian continued to live on the ranch for many more years, surrounded by children and grandchildren, blessed with good health and the satisfaction of a life well lived. They celebrated 50 years of marriage with a huge party that brought people from miles around. All 4 of their children came with their families, and the house and grounds were filled with 3 generations of Owens. During the celebration, Emily stood up to make a toast. "To our parents," she said, raising her glass, "who taught us that love is not just a feeling but a choice you make every day. Who showed us that home is not a place, but the people you share it with. Who proved that the best things in life are built slowly, with patience and dedication and faith. Mother, Father, we love you and thank you for everything you have given us." There was not a dry eye in the room as everyone raised their glasses in agreement. Matthew and Lillian stood together, his arm around her waist, her head on his shoulder, and looked out at the gathered faces of their family. "This," Lillian thought, was the mansion she had been meant to find all along. Not walls and floors and fancy furnishings, but these people, this love that had grown and expanded to fill so many hearts. They lived to see great-grandchildren born, tiny babies who carried on the family name and legacy. They lived to see the ranch thrive and expand even further under Michael's management. They lived to see Sarah finally settle down and marry, James become renowned for his skill with animals, Emily become a grandmother herself. When Matthew was 73, he had a fall while working with the horses. He recovered, but it left him weaker, and Lillian watched him age in a way that frightened her. They had been together so long she could not imagine life without him. They spent more time together, less time on separate tasks. They would sit for hours in the parlor or on the porch, just being together, storing up memories against a future they both knew was coming. "Promise me something," Matthew said one evening as they sat watching another brilliant Arizona sunset. "Anything," Lillian replied. "Promise me you will not grieve too long when I am gone, that you will find joy in our children and grandchildren, in the life we built together." "I cannot bear the thought of you being sad. Matthew, please do not talk like that. We have to talk about it sometime, my love. I am an old man and I have lived a full life. A blessed life because you were in it, but when my time comes I need to know you will be all right." Lillian felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "I will be all right because you taught me how to be strong. But Matthew Owen, I will grieve as long as I need to because I have loved you with everything in me for 52 years. You do not just get over losing that." He pulled her close. "Then grieve if you must, but promise me that afterwards you will remember the joy. Remember the laughter, the love, the life we shared. Promise me you will look at our family and know that what we created together lives on." "I promise," she whispered into his shoulder. Matthew lived 3 more years, growing frailer but never losing his sharp mind or gentle spirit. He died peacefully in his sleep one spring night, with Lillian beside him. She woke to find him gone and lay there for a long time, holding his hand, saying goodbye to the man who had been her partner, her lover, her best friend for 55 years. The grief was overwhelming. But true to her promise, Lillian did not let it consume her. She grieved openly and honestly, supported by her children and grandchildren who surrounded her with love. She cried when she needed to cry, laughed when she remembered funny moments, talked about Matthew to anyone who would listen. She kept him alive through her stories, making sure the younger grandchildren and the great-grandchildren knew what kind of man he had been. And slowly, over time, the sharp pain of loss softened into something gentler, a bittersweet ache mixed with gratitude for all the years they had shared. Lillian continued to live on the ranch, in the house Matthew had built, surrounded by family. She lived to be 82, still sharp and active until the very end. On her last evening, her children gathered around her bed. She smiled at each of them, these people she and Matthew had created together, and beyond them to the grandchildren and great-grandchildren who filled the house. "I had a good life," she told them. "I expected a mansion and found a cabin. I expected comfort and found hard work. But I also found love, real love, and that made everything else worthwhile. Your father made that cabin feel like heaven, and every day after was a gift. Remember that, all of you. It is not what you have but who you love that makes a life rich." She died peacefully that night, and her children buried her beside Matthew on a hill overlooking the ranch, where the view stretched for miles across the desert they had both loved. On her headstone, beneath her name and dates, they carved the words Matthew had once said to her. "She made my life heaven." The ranch continued for generations, passed down through the family, each generation adding to the legacy Matthew and Lillian had begun. The old cabin was preserved and maintained, a reminder of where it all started. And the story of the mail-order bride who expected a mansion, but found something infinitely more valuable, became family legend, told and retold, teaching each new generation that love is not found in grand gestures and material wealth, but in the quiet moments, the daily choice to honor and cherish another person, and the commitment to build a life together no matter what challenges arise. Matthew and Lillian's love story did not end with their deaths. It lived on in their children and grandchildren, in the ranch they had built, in the community they had helped shape. It lived on in the values they had instilled and the example they had set. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun set over the Arizona desert in shades of gold and purple, those who lived on the ranch swore they could feel the presence of that long-ago couple who had turned a small cabin and a cowboy's dream into a legacy of love that would endure for generations to come. The end.